Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our last presentation in this academic year speaker series, Toxicology and Societies, the Impacts of Chemicals in Our Lives. I'm Ruth Sofield, an environmental toxicology and professor at Western Washington University. My co-host is Tracy Collier.
Hey, Ruth.
Hi, Tracy. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for being here. Tracy is a toxicologist who is retired from NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center and continues his work as a consultant. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we at Western Washington University are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join us in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. And now I'd like to go over a few logistics. We will save questions for the end of the presentation, but you can use the Q&A feature on your screen at any time. You will be muted throughout the presentation, so we'll use this feature to interact. The focus of our speaker series is to provide understandable examples of how events with the toxicological component have consequences to people and societies. Today, we are delighted to welcome Joanna Malachinsky, who has spent a decade working on eliminating toxic chemicals from consumer products as an attorney, consultant, entrepreneur, and she also has the title of book author. And so today she will present on chronic illness and our chemical world. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you, Ruth. It's very lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So I thought I would start by just introducing myself a little bit and how I wrote my book, because it was a personal journey of learning to understand how chemicals influence our health. And for me, it started when I was in a stressed out time in my life and I was looking for stress relief, and I used to surf. So I started recreating in some urban rivers. And I remember even talking to someone who I highly respected, a friend who worked at a state environmental agency, and was asking about, are those rivers safe to swim in? And he was a little, uncertain, as all of us that kind of have worked in the topic of toxics and toxic chemicals and products and in the environment. A lot of the knowledge is theoretical and it's research-based, but he did say that, where you're swimming is basically, there's Superfund sites. There are years of environmental pollution there, but it's in the bottom. So, maybe you're okay. And I just sort of said, well, yeah, that's good enough for me. I really want to just recreate. And I thought, well, I eat organic and everything. I'm a healthy person, so I'll be okay. However, that was not true. A waterway is a dynamic place, and I did get more exposures than my body could handle, and I started getting sick. And what was happening to me felt like just like I had the flu and I couldn't shake it off. And then I started developing other problems. So it was just a bunch of little problems until I found myself sleeping 18-hour days and making the medical rounds, trying to get relief. I did end up getting some relief from acupuncture. That helped me a lot. And I also ended up with an intestinal infection and ended up with surgery. And I thought that was the problem. That was, I had infection, I had surgery, it was all over, but my chronic fatigue continued. And I kept working through that for some years. And then lo and behold, I ended up with chemical sensitivity. And I found that my chronic fatigue would flare up when I had exposures to chemicals, exposures to things such as fragrance. And so suddenly the professional background I had working in chemicals as an attorney, and I was doing also some research and whatnot, became very real to me. Those were the sort of the terminology that I was using in spreadsheets, neurotoxins or carcinogens. They were not abstract anymore. It was me and my health. I will say that at the time I had the good fortune of picking out a book from one of those little lending libraries in my neighborhood called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And I thought I knew what the book was about, but I had never read it. I had no idea what the book was really about, but there was a one chapter, about 12 pages in there, dedicated to chemicals and health. And what Rachel Carson was talking about was exactly what I was experiencing. So they had already seen that about 60 years ago, the evidence of how toxic chemicals influence human beings. And I started writing. After that, I started writing. I thought I knew a lot about chemicals, but I learned a whole lot more. And I felt that what I was doing was doing the sequel to Rachel Carson's book. And my book is called Silent Winter, Our Chemical World in Chronic Illness. And it's focused on the human health effects of our chemical world. So I'd like to start a PowerPoint presentation to guide us through today. So let's see here. Please let me know, somebody let me know. Okay, I probably need to do something to share this with you all. I don't know if Phaedra can give me feedback whether
And it's at the bottom, and there should be a green.
Oh, got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, as always, the nerves kick in and everything's a little bit different each time. Okay, great. So I'm going to just go ahead and play.
And
There I am.
looks
There's both the title of my talk today and the title of my book. So I want to talk about, I mentioned that I was dealing with a lot of legacy chemicals originally. So these are chemicals that were used in manufacturing years ago, then ended up in our environment, and then I was exposed. I've also noticed over time that, I sort of did a forensic exercise of thinking about my lifetime and what types of chemicals I've been exposed to, the pesticides, the plastics and everything like that. But I want to just zoom to now, sort of what are the big chemical categories of our time, and talk about that so that you're aware of it. The first ones are pesticides, and that might sound really obvious, but I do want to mention that there are some categories of things that people don't think about. We've got the insecticides, we've got the fungicides and the herbicides, but we also have disinfectants, and that's really big right now. There are different types of different disinfectants. There's things like alcohol, which is relatively benign, but there are some heavy duty disinfectants that are being used out there in the world. And those are also pesticides. There's kind of in a category of biocides. They're designed to kill life. And that's what these chemicals essentially are. They might not be having as acute of an effect on us as they are on insects or other pests, but they are having an effect on us. They're also neurotoxic. That's the way that they work. They disrupt the workings of the nervous system. And we have a nervous system too as human beings that affects not only the way we think, our cognition, but it also affects our locomotion. So everything from our ability to move and maintain balance and speech and things like that. So that's it's kind of a serious issue to have a lot of these chemicals around us. They also disrupt our microbiome, and as we're learning, our microbiome, which can be found not only in our gut but in our lungs and virtually every part of our body, is very dominant. And there's more microbiome than us, depending on how you slice the pie. And they're responsible for helping fuel us, to run us, to make sure that we're doing the things that we do. And they're part of our immune system. So, some people think, oh, pesticides are not such a big deal. Well, actually it is. I do want to I have an image here from the Pesticide Action Network, and I do just want to say that pesticides are problematic also with the use of GMOs. Some people think that GMOs reduce our need for pesticides, but they actually increase our need for pesticides because you just have to keep, you're actually applying pesticides and the plant is resistant to it. So you just keep applying more and more to try to get rid of the bugs and things like that. But essentially, we're using more and more pesticides rather than less. Okay, the next category that I want to talk about, I'm just gonna hold on. I'm just gonna do this real quick. I just want to make sure that I watch the time while we're talking. I know that this makes my screen a little bit smaller, but hopefully this is still okay. If that's a problem, please let me know. I want to talk about PFAS. This is another. I have 4 categories of chemicals I want to talk about. I want to talk about PFAS. There's a lot of discussion about those right now. They are waterproof, they're flame proof, they're nonstick, they're grease proof. They're considered inert, which people used to think that meant that they can't harm us, but their harm is in the fact that they're designed to last, as are all 4 of these categories of chemicals I'm talking about. They're designed to last, so they're very hard to break down in our bodies. They're very hard to break down in the environment, and they get in the way in very different ways. For example, they're hormone disruptors, meaning they kind of hijack the process that normally happens in our bodies related to hormones. And hormones are not just about, sex hormones. It's about our energy levels, our use of insulin, and almost virtually every process that goes on in our body. They also congest our bodies. Again, they're inert things that the body can't break down, so they're hanging out there, getting in the way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay. Then I want to talk about fragrance. People think of fragrance as perfume or something like that, but if you really start to look at our world, especially in recent decades and more so in recent years, we have a proliferation of fragrance everywhere. It's in laundry detergents, it's in candles, it's in air freshening products, cleaning products. And fragrance itself, when it's just listed as fragrance, conventional fragrance, can be hundreds of chemicals at a time mixed in there that historically have not been required to be disclosed. There's some changes now in terms of disclosure requirements, but there's still a lot of chemicals there that we don't even know about, and certainly the consumer doesn't know about. And more, there's been a trend to make these chemicals formulations in such a way that they last longer. You'll see that being advertised. Your clothes will stay clean for weeks on end, things like that. You don't actually want that. That means that those chemicals don't break down, and they're going to get clogged up in your body. Your body's going to have a hard time breaking them down. And fragrance is no longer tolerated, according to some studies, up to about 25% of the population. People are getting headaches, they're getting nauseous. So it's kind of becoming the secondhand smoke. Plastics, we all know, we have heard about that. They're off-gassing and leaching continuously. They do mimic hormones. They're toxic, but they're also attractive to our biology. They actually can smell like a mammal. And our bodies will sometimes also get fooled and think that it's something sort of bioactive that's useful, but it's not, and gets in the way. And they're also breaking down into microplastics that are congesting our bodies. And that's, we might have heard of that. The reports originally about fish and things like that, but that's also happening in our bodies. And I'll mention that a little bit more in a little bit later. Okay, so let's talk about chemicals staying in your body for a long time. Again, when does it happen? When they're designed to last, so that long-lasting, fresh scent, not good. Forever chemicals, the long-chain PFAS, again, very, very hard to break down. Those can take hundreds of years. We're finding that there's certain bacteria and certain conditions that will break those down, but they're not really breaking down very well in our bodies at all. The other condition, you can have chemicals that in theory are short-lived, or in studies and in lab studies are short-lived, but they become long-lived under certain conditions when you're exposed to a lot of them continuously. And that's happening a lot. That's happening a lot with certain chemicals that are found in personal care products, some pesticides, in plastic packaging. We're just inundated with it. So even though in theory a chemical might be listed as short-lived, when you're constantly dealing with it, it's a lot of work for your body, and at some point you just slow down, right? It's just constantly dealing with it. The other way that it can happen is if your detoxification pathways are obstructed or damaged by previous chemical exposures. So you might have some areas of your body that are just clogged up with chemicals, and so suddenly that whole detox process is not happening as efficiently as it should. Or you've got damage, like it's very common to have liver damage. That's something that Rachel Carson already talked about, and so that was already known. And you can have DNA damage, also very common. That the medical profession talks about that as, oh, you have a certain gene. Well, the reality is that you have an activated gene or you have a mutated gene as a result of chemical exposures, and suddenly you are left unable to detoxify at the same rate as a very healthy person, and you're being overwhelmed and cannot detoxify as well. Okay, so how toxic chemicals cause chronic illness? I want to talk about categories of sort of chemically induced disease to help you understand how this is working, how this is manifesting in your body, so you kind of have a big picture of how these things happen. Okay, so neurotoxicity. I talked about pesticides as being neurotoxic. So it's a disturbance in the proper functioning of your nerve cells. Again, the changes are to your cognitive capacity and mental health, because that's what your nerve cells are doing. And then there's neuromuscular changes. Again, the loss of coordination. It can be weakness. It can even be paralysis of an extreme case. But suddenly that whole locomotion aspect of your body is being affected. And then there can be neurodevelopmental disorders such as ADHD or autism. And those can be, I'll mention those again, but those can be a hybrid. It can be caused by something short-term, or they could have been caused by some damage or something long-term in the past. So, here's the most common example, the pesticides. Here you're seeing that there's, in the developmental process, the neurotoxin is actually hijacking the growth and development of the body. And so, that can happen to toddlers. It can happen in the womb. It can even happen to adults. I mean, if you think about it, we're constantly, like, our bodies are constantly renewing ourselves, right? It's worse, obviously, at younger age, because that's where the development processes are shaping who we are rather than just kind of renewing what's going on. But it's a very well-known problem that unfortunately gets dismissed a lot, right? And just common society. The weakened immune system. So this is extremely common. I will say that another very common immune system weakener is sugar. And another one is a lot of free iron in the blood. So for example, if you've had an injury or for other reasons have a lot of free iron in your blood, because microbes feed on sugar and they feed on free iron. And so, for example, when we see with COVID, there's a lot of people, for example, with diabetes who end up having very severe cases of COVID. Usually it's because they have a lot of sugar in their blood system, especially if they're not taking care of their health with diet, in addition to insulin. And then they also tend to have a lot of free iron in the blood. There's an association with that. And so that creates conditions for microbiome, sort of a bad bacteria to grow. But generally, there's a weakened immune system. Your immune system is working hard at trying to deal with these chemicals, right? It's just got too many pots in a fire. It's hard to fight off something else. And so it might suddenly have an inability to fight off an infection. It's very common for people to have a reduced body temperature if they're at a state where they maybe have been diagnosed with something like chronic fatigue or some other condition with a weakened immune system. Their body temperature is low, and if you have a virus or something like that, you generally, the body responds by raising the body temperature to kill those bugs. And if it can't do that, your hormones are disrupted with chemicals in your body. Your body's not able to raise the temperature. So most people who have a weak immune system are actually walking around with a very low baseline body temperature. It's harder to heal injuries, so sometimes people don't think of that as part of your immune system, but anything that happens in your body, your immune system is responding, whether it's to deal with potential cancer cells or to heal injury, or fight off anything, whether it's chemical, biological, or sort of radiological things like radioactive material or EMF. It becomes more difficult. And then you also have an altered body chemistry, because you literally do. You have things coursing in your bloodstream all over your system that is not normal. It causes a disruption to the ecobiome. This has been studied actually in a very narrowed down study of how this happens. And our ecobiome, like people kind of don't realize, they hear these terms like, oh, E. coli or botulism, this bad bacteria, and they think that there are these isolated cases and this bacteria comes into your body and invades and suddenly you have an infection. Well, actually it doesn't work like that, because these bad bacteria are all over the place. Half the time they're actually, really all of the time they're already in your body. They're just kind of hanging out there, not doing anything. They're just benign. But when your body chemistry is altered, when your immune system is weakened, but especially when the body chemistry is altered so that chemically those bugs get a signal that, hey, it's time to wake up and attack. That's what happens. And that's what scientists are finding, is that you alter the body chemistry with, throwing in a bunch of pollutants, and suddenly, boom, that naturally occurring thing that's been in your body suddenly decides, oh my God, time to wake up and attack and build giant cities of bacteria. So that, those are, unfortunately some serious problems that we're dealing with that are not getting enough attention today, if you ask me. But it does come out sometimes, when we had COVID, we had studies coming out saying that air pollution, for example, can raise the risk of death from COVID-19 significantly, 51% according to the study. So, some of that is starting to come out, and that's good news that we're starting to pay attention to that, that there's this connection between our environment and even outbreaks. Okay, another category is chemical congestion. So I mentioned this idea of these chemicals aren't breaking down. I mentioned these 4 categories of chemicals, especially, that aren't breaking down. And what are they doing? Well, they're just building up. They build up in our organs, in our tissues, in our bones, in our cells, in our vascular system. And so what they're doing is essentially interfering with 2 things. One is the nutrient flow into our cells. So, that whole pathway of we eat, all of that gets converted into energy and nutrients, and they flow around in our body and get into our cells. Well, there's congestion, so that stuff isn't necessarily getting through. And then there's the waste removal process. Some of that is chemical waste, right? We talked about detox, but then there's just the fundamental waste from our bodies. So each cell of our body is producing waste. Every organ of our body is producing waste. We think of just like, peeing or something as waste, but actually it's just at the very micro level, everybody's producing waste, and that stuff has to be removed. Otherwise there's buildup and toxicity and unhealthy state, and chemicals are blocking those pathways. So we're getting congested, and things are just, it's like throwing a wrench in the gears. So autoimmune responses are very common, such as pain and fatigue, swelling. All those things are just a sign that the body's, there's an area that's congested. Things aren't moving. We might experience it as pain. We might be fatigued because we're clogged up and there's a lot of waste building up. We might feel swelling. So, all of these symptoms are a reflection of that things are congested. And then very common also is weight gain. Weight gain is very common. because what the body's trying to do is, let's just do something with these chemicals and quarantine them. And it will start to produce fat and to quarantine these chemicals in the fat. Fat is a really good storage mechanism for that. Another thing that the body does is produce these sort of, the liver starts to take cholesterol, natural cholesterol that the body produces. The body produces the vast majority of our cholesterol. And it uses that to create sort of these fatty deposits and quarantine chemicals in and around the liver of itself. Because the liver is the primary detoxification organ. And so when it gets overwhelmed, it says, oh my God, I'm just gonna, okay, let's just create some fatty tissues and quarantine that. And in the past, we've sort of studied that as fatty liver disease from alcoholism, if you think of like alcoholism causes toxicity. But now what we're seeing is a vast rise in people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So they're not drinking alcohol, but they have a lot of toxicity in their body. And that's also resulting in this fatty liver disease. So here's just a quick research article abstract about autoimmune disease growing pretty rapidly globally, and that there's this connection between toxic chemicals and autoimmune conditions. So hormone disruption, I mentioned hormones. Again, it's not just the sex hormones, it's anything related to your thyroid, energy levels, things like insulin and blood sugar, temperature regulation, all these things. They rely on receptors. So there's hormone receptors in our body, and chemicals can clog up those receptors. They can sort of hijack the connections that need to be made. And this leads to problems such as the low energy, the blood sugar issues, the problems with weight gain. And again, the most vulnerable organs are the thyroid, the reproductive organs, the liver, the brain organs, because those are the organs that are very hormonally active. And again, just a quick headline: plasticizers, which are found in plastics, that's what makes them a little bit more pliable rather than brittle. They have negative impacts on the thyroid hormone system, no surprise. Okay, bones and teeth. I really want to talk about this topic because it's very personal to me, and a lot of people I know who suffer from chronic illness at a very early age are starting to notice demineralization of their bones and teeth. So this is happening for a few reasons. Toxic chemicals themselves can displace minerals in bones and teeth, or prevent the proper remineralization that happens continuously in our body. Originally, we found this with smokers and cadmium. Cadmium is a chemical it's a heavy metal that's generally found in cigarettes. And we found that smokers were very susceptible to osteoporosis. But this is happening with not only heavy metals, but with toxic chemicals, man-made toxic chemicals. Calcium is very commonly displaced, most likely also phosphorus. And as a result, there's this increased risk of osteoporosis and tooth loss. There are other processes at work in that chemicals cause stress, oxidative stress. And with calcium, for example, calcium is actually used in almost every transaction, cellular transaction in our body. Like when our bodies are stressed with some environmental pollutant, be it a chemical or biological or radiological, the calcium tends to get dumped into the cell and sort of used up inappropriately. There's just like constant use of calcium, and there isn't enough free calcium to remineralize the bones and teeth. So I know that's a little bit complicated, but just to kind of give you a sense of how vast and nuanced this is, that it's not just sort of like one thing. It's that the chemicals in our bodies, they might not be acutely, people aren't like overtly dropping right in the street from chemical exposure, unless it's just a very vast quantity, but their health is deteriorating over time. And yeah, again, environmental toxins are a major cause of bone loss. Okay, arrested development. So this is, in the past, people thought of this as birth defects, but what's happening is that we're having these invisible birth defects, and it's just invisible defects in things that we don't think about. Malformed sperm, that's becoming very common. That leads to fertility issues. Malformed uterus, the uterus is not the shape that it traditionally would be in. So a baby, suddenly, a woman might find, geez, I'm frustrated, I'm not able to carry a baby to term, or she might have a baby and then have problems over the years with tears in the uterus from childbirth that leads to other complications. And those were changes that happened in her body, probably when she was in the womb, during the exposures that her mom had at the time. Weakened spine, it's been really interesting and talking to people in the chronic fatigue community. Not only are they having problems with chronic fatigue, but evidence is showing up that they have other hidden birth defects. We know defects like spina bifida. People sometimes have heard that term because that came home with Vietnam veterans from their toxic chemical exposure and their children. But there are similar things where basically the ligaments, the tendons, the spinal column basically is weakened and didn't develop fully. And so into adulthood, they're having problems. And then that in itself can sometimes cause chronic fatigue as well, right? Your spine's not holding up itself. And then many other unknown malformations. I mean, there's so many things that we don't know about, but that could cause problems in adulthood. And, this was before the pandemic. An article came out about disinfectants causing birth defects in mice. They might not be causing overt defects in us, but they could be having some undermining the development of the human body. So chronic fatigue, another category. I talked about this quite a bit, but I think it's been a big one, especially in the age of COVID. I think that's really come into people's forefront with long-term COVID, but the body's basically overwhelmed. It shuts down, it's self-protective. People say it can be, the researchers say it can be chemical, biological, or from other sort of environmental pollution type factors. But basically, it's most likely a combination of all. Like it really takes a lot. Our bodies are resilient, but it really takes a lot, for things to grade to the point where the body decides just like, I'm so overwhelmed, I'm shutting down. So what the body's doing is it's not producing enough energy, but it's in hibernation mode, and it's sort of saying, I'm not going to let things into my cells anymore. There's too many toxic things coming at me. I can't deal with them. But it also means that nutrients are not getting in and waste cannot get out. So it kind of can get worse over time, because while the body is sort of hibernating, it's also not getting nourished and it's not eliminating waste. And chronic fatigue is not just fatigue. It usually includes brain fog and a lot of other issues. All the other issues that we see, everything that I've mentioned so far can be happening in the body at the same time. This is my book. The title in a way was inspired by the chapter on chronic fatigue, because it is a form of hibernation. I thought it was kind of ironic to call it silent winter. But it's also where I started out, trying to understand chronic fatigue. And then as I mentioned, over time, as my body improved and I came out of that state, I was really only getting chronic fatigue after chemical exposures, which was very interesting. And so I kind of graduated, my health improved, but I graduated to having chemical sensitivity, which includes strong fragrance sensitivity. The body's no longer detoxifying effectively. Chemicals in everyday environment, that other people can tolerate, cause acute damage because there's already damage in the body and you can't detoxify very well. There's a lot of inflammation, fatigue, all the itis conditions, all that sort of inflammatory type stuff. Cognitive issues are very common after exposures. And what basically happens is individuals who have this and this condition, or I would call it a disability, can have degrees. People can be in a very extreme case where they're basically completely avoiding the modern world and living out in some society in the high desert somewhere, or in the desert, in the middle of nowhere somewhere, or they're avoiding socializing. They can't go to church because everybody's using using fragrance, for example. So that's kind of where people are at. And just something example of this from the past that came up in the papers was, this is a condition that's been around for decades. It's just not getting that media attention that it should be, and might be getting a little bit more now as there's increasingly more people with the condition. But there was a 1996 chlorine spill in Ohio, and a number of people ended up chemically sensitive. We've also had people who have lived in buildings that didn't have good ventilation, that were built with there's a lot of toxic chemicals that can be used in buildings, ended up getting sick and developing chemical sensitivity. So there's definitely cases of things like that. Okay, I will just briefly touch upon solutions. I've been the sort of the canary, and my life has become, like, my personal life has become about just trying to figure out how to live a cleaner, healthier life, because I do have chemical sensitivity. So I'm a canary to all these things. It's basically to go natural. I try to do things locally as much as possible, organic and simple. And that applies to the food that I eat, the personal care products I use. A lot of products I don't really even buy. Why buy lotion with 60 ingredients in it when I can just slather on some olive oil or coconut oil and call it good? Cleaning products, baking soda, water, soap, vinegar. I use Bon Ami. I'm not quite sure why I need some, fancy bottle of stuff to spray around. I don't. Clothing choices, I've gone back to natural materials. That's been very helpful for me. Packaging, instead of plastic, I use ball jars. They work great. So it really does come down to my everyday choices. And then there's other people who work for companies that are dealing with these products and manufacturing, and they have to make other choices. They're not up to me. All I can do is control what is in my environment. They will have to make those decisions for themselves. But I hope that this presentation will both help people who are trying to make good choices for themselves, and who are trying to make choices for their companies and their institutions. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Let's stop sharing and let's move into conversation mode.
Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing what is a personal journey, but also you were able to bring in your experience and knowledge, and then it looks like learn a lot about these chemicals and what they can do. And I was struck by something that you said, and I wrote it down. People aren't overtly dying on the street from these chemical exposures. And as a toxicologist, an environmental toxicologist, I think a lot about how the public thinks about chemicals in their lives. And one of my thoughts has been that we don't see people or animals or wildlife just falling over dead now, because in the case of wildlife, we've really done a good job of limiting the chemicals that are getting into the environment that cause that type of toxicity. But I like to talk about these other types of effects that you can't really tell came from the exposure to the chemical. And so I always like to say in my classes, I say, my daughter, I was pregnant with her, and maybe I ate something while I was pregnant that caused her IQ to be 5 points lower. I don't know that because I don't know what her IQ would have been, right? So this loss of function. And so that's another kind of thing here. But you talking about these chronic illnesses, they're caused by other things, and it's hard to link back to the chemical exposure. So I'm just kind of curious if you could maybe comment on your thoughts related to all of that, and where we are today, and thinking about how to get people to think about that these chemicals can be causing that illness that you have right now, or something. It might have changed something about you or your offspring and you don't know it. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think the first thing I want to say is kind of speak to the opposite audience, and that don't let this drive you insane, because you can't avoid it. You cannot avoid these chemicals. They're everywhere, so don't let it drive you insane. But you can reduce your exposure for sure, and it will make a difference. Yeah, I mean, our bodies are very resilient, and so you have a lot of different outcomes. And then there's some people who they were lucky, or their families lived in very clean environments, and so they're more robust. And then somebody else will have already lived in polluted environments for a couple generations, and they're less robust. And so it both feels unfair, but it becomes even more difficult for people to understand. And it's especially frustrating to see, both in my parents' generation and my husband's generation, meaning his parents and my parents and that generation, there are a lot of people who are still quite robust. And so they think that we're super sensitive. And I think that people are probably seeing more of that with their kids too. And I think that's just the reality, that every generation has been hit more and more, and you're just going to see that. And that's probably what's going to save us, is that the younger generations are just going to say, I can't deal with this, or more and more people are going to be sensitive. But there's so many disparities, and I think that's why it creates a lot of conflict about whether this is even a problem. I will say that there's still incidents of both people and animals dropping. It's not getting that much attention, unfortunately. And it's so very difficult to say this chemical caused your problem, caused this to happen. You have to actually individually test for each chemical to even know it's there. You can't just say, here's the blood samples and we found all these chemicals in there. It doesn't work that way. So we still have those problems, and they're not getting recognized.
Yeah, the science is so challenging, and then you add the fact that individuals can make their own decisions and have different levels of acceptance, and then policy and regulations. It's just such a complicated world to be in. I have questions about. Let me pull these up. Do you believe autism in children can be from chemicals? And maybe you could talk about what you know about the evidence that relates that.
Yeah.
Those two.
Yeah, there's a lot of research on this topic, and there are a lot of things, there are a lot of factors that can cause autism, including chemical exposures, for sure. And it can vary, they can be, again, things that are really developmental defects, but they can be more things that are happening right now in the child's life. I mean, you can induce a state of autism. I can induce a state of autism in myself with certain exposures. So I wasn't born autistic. So I guess I say that to give people hope. If you do have a child, or you're in a situation where you're autistic, anything you can do to clean up your environment is going to make your situation better.
What about claims that vaccines are a source of toxicity and can cause things like autism? What is your?
Sure. So let's see, which way to approach this? I guess the short answer is yes, it can be a factor. I mean, basically what you're doing is you're injecting something past your immune system right into your bloodstream. And your body is going to say, what is this exactly? And yes, some of those chemicals, there are chemicals in there that are meant to basically make the vaccine more effective. And some of them are based on heavy metals, some of them are based on, something more synthetic. But, it's different than if you're eating just a piece of tuna and you know that there's some mercury in there, and there's naturally occurring mercury in tuna, and then there's additional mercury that might be from environmental pollution, but then you're also eating selenium from the tuna that's there to help you detox, and your body's kind of, dealing with it, and your immune system's dealing it in terms of your microbiome. But it's very different just to inject something into your bloodstream. I mean, it can be something really good, like people need vitamin B injections, and right away they're energetic and happy. But when you get something that's kind of some chemical cocktail, even if it's light, your body's going to say like, what is this? It might overreact. It might get a memory that there was something negative about those chemicals, and sort of you kind of start writing down a script that if I ever run into this, I need to get on it. And that get on it might be, I'm going to shut down, experience it as chronic fatigue, or I might have a huge overreaction, inflammatory response. Those are two common things that might happen.
Yeah. And I think so with the vaccines, like you talk about the preservatives, and that's clearly an exposure, and then how does that translate into response? Like, as you said, it can be these really subtle things possibly, and it's really hard to know for sure if you as an individual are responding that way. But something else you said with the mercury and the fish, like I personally had this great conversation with a risk assessor right before my own pregnancy, and they said, even the people who know toxicology aren't considering the benefit of eating fish because they're so afraid of the mercury in the fish. And I heard that and I said, okay, yeah, I do think there's a lot of benefit during my pregnancy to eat fish. And so I tried to make good choices about which fish I ate. And I forced myself to eat more than I think I would have because of the fear associated with that mercury. And then sure enough, not too much after I had my daughter, the FDA and the EPA did one of the first studies to look at both the benefit and the detriment of eating fish. And they found that you actually can eat too much and that's detrimental, and you can, because of the benefits of the fish. And so I'm just kind of curious, like how you think about like this personal, it comes down to a personal decision where you weigh benefits and risks associated with these different things. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, a lot goes to what your baseline is, where your body is. There was a time where I was so sick that I couldn't eat fish. I didn't have I didn't have the scientific study to tell you why I was reacting, but I couldn't eat fish. And there's sometimes that people can't eat dairy, but your body improves and you can eat it and you can eat more. And that's the same thing with vaccines, right? Like some people will be like, oh great, I got it, I benefited from it, and other people will not do so well. Yeah, so I just think it really depends. You just use your own best judgment, but definitely I say go with organic. I can't say how important that is. I react very, very strongly. I really try to focus my diet on including a lot of healthy things. And I used to have to avoid certain things and thinking that it was like, I'm reacting to dairy. I can't, eat fat because there's too many toxins in there. But now I'm eating those things, but only when I'm not reacting to it. And, if it's clean, and since I'm a canary, I know right away when there's a problem.
Yeah. And I often as a professor get these questions about what can I do? And so like I like how you're framing this. Do the things that, and I'll use my words, these may not be yours, but this is how I'm hearing it. Like, do the things that you can do. Don't scare yourself, but there are some really smart things. And so I personally do eat organic. And for me, those benefits outweigh the costs. But I think there's other things that I always say, like, don't put your plastic Tupperware into a microwave and cook your food in it. And certainly don't put something like tomato sauce, which is acidic, because you're going to just pull chemicals into your food that way. So there are some really like things that are like, of course, that's easy to do. I just buy glass now instead of Tupperware. Do you have other examples like that you haven't talked about where they're low-hanging fruit to do that can reduce chemical exposure? Or do you think you've kind of touched on all of them?
Well, I think it's a lot, and the reality is that low-hanging fruit is very relative to each person. I would say just get rid of the fragrance in your life, but some people that's super, super hard for them, or because of where they work, that's super, super hard for them. So just start somewhere, just take a baby step and just keep going with it. And it takes time to adjust. I think I said at some point that, I kind of poo-pooed sugar. And for some people, they're never going to let go of it, but you could reduce it and that would be a benefit to you.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Because there are several people who are asking, like, what can I do? And there's also some people thinking about how you would frame these issues in the context of people who are thinking about policies and regulations and deregulation. Where do you, how does that come into your thinking as we think about that?
So with deregulation, I just I'm going to put a plug in for another book that's not my book. There's a book by a Berkeley professor called Strangers in Their Own Land. It is about Louisiana and communities in Louisiana who are very libertarian and pro deregulation. And they live in communities that have a lot of environmental devastation that has happened over the decades. And I just think I'd say read that book. It explains so much about that thinking. But basically, the more you deregulate, the more vulnerable people become. And when you start, and for some reason, it goes the other way, that if you destroy the environment in a community, people get very upset, first and foremost at the regulators, and they want to blow up government. So they want to deregulate. So I guess the point of all that is that, we need both our institutions and our self-regulating corporations to be loving and take care of us to begin with.
Well, and that kind of segues into another question. I mean, these are really personal issues for some of our audience members, and we have one of the attendees who wanted to know about the medical system and how if they're not and they use terms like feeling like they were gaslit, for example. So how about that as you're interacting with medical professionals? What are your thoughts on how we can be good advocates for ourselves around these types of issues?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll admit my mother's a doctor, but I will also admit to you that I don't go to doctors. I don't go to the conventional medical profession to get help. And that's true for probably the majority of people who have these environmental illnesses, because formally it's not recognized in the system. So you're not going to get help. And then even if you don't have an environmental, what you think of as an environmental illness, but you have a problem that you're looking for a solution that's beyond here's the pill or here's the diagnostic procedure to tell you what's wrong with you, you're not going to get help because it's not set up for that. So most people go with alternative medicine and end up getting their own personal PhDs in alternative health to treat themselves. And there's a lot of Facebook groups for people who have chronic illness. So I recommend actually joining those, because you'll find people who have very similar experiences and maybe have some wisdom around when they do need to go into the doctor, how they interact with them, and what other things they've done that have helped them.
Okay, great. So I'm kind of curious about, sorry, I just spaced out. I'm not trying to formulate a hard question. So I think this will probably be our last question, but thinking about organic versus foods, and those are complicated decisions. Like if you're solely focused on the chemical exposure, then organic makes sense, although there's different ways to describe what organic is. But also thinking about things like carbon footprint, so eating locally and local economies. How does that come into your thinking for you personally, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, for certain. So there's a few things going on. One is we think that organic sort of covers everything, but it doesn't cover pollution that's happening that is not being contributed to by the farmer. So adjacent airport, or the land has been contaminated in the past, or anything else that's happening. So pay attention to what's going on in your area, because if you know that you've got a massive PFAS contamination and your waterways and that's what the farmers are using to sprinkle the crops locally, then, you just want to be aware of that, because that kind of undermines the organicness of what you're dealing with. But at the same time, local farmers, especially small, when I say local, I also mean small, or I'm trying to think of like small family farms. Those are individuals who are taking a little bit more responsibility for the quality of their food, because the choices that they're making are going to influence their health, their kids' health, their animals' health, and they can't afford the sort of industrial approach. And they're not going to, as easily say, I'll make that person apply that toxic chemical and get it all over themselves. I have to do it myself. So I want to avoid that, right? It's more personal. So they're going to take more responsibility for what's happening. And so there's a huge benefit to going local for that reason. There's also other things that we're finding, for example, that, you might have heard the trend toward grass-fed animals. And local farmers, small farmers tend to do that. The benefit of that is that those animals are outside, and as it turns out, they're producing vitamin D, so that when you're eating fat from those animals, you're actually getting vitamin D that you wouldn't get from a factory farmed animal. So, and that's an example of one thing, but there are many such small changes that accumulate in terms of changing the quality of the food that you're getting.
Yeah, that's spectacular. I just wanted to thank you for being here, and really appreciate it, and thank all of our audience members for being with us this year, and we'll sign off for the academic year. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.